Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And it is time for another starter pack where I go over a series of records that I recommend to you to give you a taste of, to give you your bearings with a particular genre or movement within popular music. And in this episode, we are going to be talking about folk rock, a genre dating back to the 1960s, around a time when we had an influx of contemporary folk songwriters charting records, getting popular, people like Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan, Townes Van Zandt, I want to say Leonard Cohen to an extent as well. There was a lot of very popular folk music dropping around that time. And quite a few artists in that wave of folk music would go on to make folk rock music themselves. And, we're talking about an era of music where not only was this new wave of folk music bubbling up, but also there was an incredibly huge demand for rock music and pop rock music. You had the British invasion happening at the time. So, of course, you would have artists who would take the balladry and the acoustic instrumentation of folk music and fuse that with the grooves, the drums, the guitars, the electric instrumentation, the riffs, the songwriting styles of rock music. Ba-bam, ba-boom, package them all up, you get your folk rock. And of course, because there's more than one way to skin a folk rock cat, I'm going to be talking about a series of records here that cover a bunch of different sounds and styles and miniature eras within the genre. So, all right, let's get through these recommendations somewhat quickly. I do want to link them all down below so you guys can listen for yourselves and just get a taste for this stuff, and hopefully you get turned on to some records that you enjoy and maybe have not heard yet, though these are not super obscure and they're not like a top 10 list or anything like that. This is basically what you want to try to give yourself an idea of what's going on in this style of music. So without any further ado, we are going to be starting off with a 1985 album from the band The Pogues. This is a pretty unique album in this list as it fuses together, yes, elements of folk, yes, elements of rock music, but being a band hailing from Ireland, the Pogues bring together elements of Celtic music and Irish music, traditional song from their home country, stories from their home country, but they give it a bit of a nasty, almost punkish twist. I would say that this album right here out of this entire list is maybe the most punk inspired because the attitude on this record is quite brash, is quite nasty. And of course, the Pogues would go on to inspire groups that would come down the line, bringing together elements of folk and Irish music and punk like Dropkick Murphys, also Flogging Molly. So if this mix of influences and styles interests you, give this a shot because it really does not get much better than the very raw and gritty Rum Sodomy and the Lash. Moving on from there, we have Neil Young's 1970 record, not exactly one of the earliest albums in the folk rock genre, but still a very great record after the gold rush. Some of Neil's most memorable ballads end up on this record. Certainly, I think his most covered song of all time, Only Love Will Break Your Heart, which is maybe a bit too saccharine of a tune for my taste personally. And I admit I'm not like the biggest Neil Young head of all time or anything like that, but this is a great record. Not a super demanding listen at 35 minutes. There are some pretty powerful ballads and great fusions of that electric and folk instrumentation on this track, or rather this album. The song Southern Man is maybe one of the heaviest and most despondent, droning, distorted ballads within this particular genre. Also, the title track of this thing is a great piano song. And, just track for track, not too many albums in the folk rock genre, or just in the folk, contemporary folk genre in the 70s, outdo this record. This is a pretty fantastic album from Neil. No complaints about it. Moving on from there, the most contemporary album in this list came out in 2013. We have Kurt Weill's Wakin on a Pretty Daze. Many viewers of this video should already be familiar with this album. It was one of my favorite records of the year it dropped. And if you're looking for some blends of folk and rock music, but also psychedelic music, certainly not the only album or band or artist, rather, of this era to be toying with this style. You have the War on Drugs, and certainly not the first artist to be producing music with a folk kind of psychedelic edge. You can go back and look at bands like Love, for example, for that sort of thing. But Kurt definitely has his own sound within this style, especially on this record, with numerous tracks on this thing featuring these very linear, almost krautrockian song structures. It's very enveloping, it's very hypnotic. Kurt's drawling voice certainly lends itself to the very trippy aesthetic of this record. Yeah, it has its flaws, it has a few shortcomings here and there, but it's still a very pleasant and I'll say a very immersive listen. So Kurt Weill, Wakin on A Pretty Daze. All right, moving on from there, a list listing out must listens from, sound like a tongue twister, from the folk rock genre is not complete without a mention of the Godfather Bob Dylan, and especially what is most likely his most celebrated album in the genre, Highway 61 Revisited. Maybe not my favorite of his in the genre, that might be Blonde on Blonde, but this is an excellent record. Pretty sure I gave this thing a classic review too on the main channel. Amazing album, very well produced. Bob Dylan's absurd and very abstract lyrics are amazing and occasionally powerful. The piano, the twangy electric guitar, the very rickety and loud and boomy drums on this thing. It is gorgeous cacophony. Amazing record, near perfect, one of Bob's best, and I would say not even just one of the best in the folk rock genre, but just like one of the best records in popular music across the spectrum, no doubt. Moving on from there, we also have Simon and Garfunkel's Bookends. On this record, they pull together some elements of folk music and also rock music and pop music too. They have their legendary hit, Here's to You, Mrs. Robinson, on here as well. Quite a diverse mix of songs on here. You have some more short and abstract bits sort of filling out the track list. You have electric and anthemic cuts on here like America. Not every song on this thing is a folk rock song, but there are some tracks on here that are some great folk rock tracks. And, you know, it's certainly a good example of more contemporary folk artists fusing the genre together with other sounds and other styles to kind of explore and update it and just shoot some different ideas out there, and the results mostly being great because you are talking about a songwriter of the caliber of Paul fricking Simon. Moving on from there, we have, of course, being a Swans fan myself, we have Michael Gira's folky, gothic, folk, experimental, folk, and rock side project, The Angels of Light, with the album How I Loved You. This record came out in 2001, so not a super old record or anything like that. Not sure what I can say about this album to really sell it to people who have already heard Swan's latest LPs, because a lot of what Gira was doing on this album would be predictive of what he would do on albums like To Be Kind as well as The Seer, which, you know, of course, like a lot of those folk and droney and linear songwriting elements, and very heavy as well, that he explores on those albums, the groundwork for a lot of that is laid down here on these tracks that are maybe a bit more mellow, but still incredibly dark, still incredibly linear, still having their heavy moments as well, maybe not as fine-tuned as some of those great experimental rock releases, but still incredibly well done. So, you know, if you do like your folk music with a kind of alternative country and a gothic and a heavy and an experimental edge, do not hesitate to give a listen to this very despondent and very mind-expanding release, Angels of Light, How I Loved You. Moving on from there, we go to Fairport Convention. Fairport Convention, Liege and Lief. This is a British folk outfit, so this is not just strictly another American folk rock fusion over here with more southern or bluesier roots. No, the Fairport Convention fuse elements of rock music with British folk, traditional folk songs. So a lot of the tunes that they're basing their tracks off of are quite archaic and regal, and it does give a certain refinement to their sound. I would say that in comparison with many of the other groups on this list, the Fairport Convention aren't incredibly raw or anything like that. Their tunes are quite light on the ear and beautiful, and I would say very mild in terms of their tone, but they have a subtle beauty to them that is quite nice, and that electric and that folk instrumentation, it blends very, very fantastically on this record, and the ballads are top-notch. Moving on from there, we have Crosby, Stills, and Nash. David Crosby and Stephen Stills and Graham Nash, all great songwriters within their own right. At the time of the release of this album in 1969, they come together into a fantastic collaborative supergroup on this record. They would release another album the next year, adding Neil Young into the fold, making it Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. This album, though, is really well done. Great tunes, great ballads on this thing. What fusions of electric and acoustic instrumentation that there are on this LP go over really well. And the pacing of a lot of these tracks is very fast and direct, like you would want out of a rock song, but of course that folk instrumentation is there. And of course, given that you are handed a trio of great vocalists on this LP, there are quite a few vocal harmonies on this album that would go on to inspire the work of groups like Fleet Foxes. So, you know, if you're looking for a kind of an inception point for a lot of those ideas and a lot of those sounds, go no further than this record, please. So one more in this list. Of course, I want to give a shout out, being a fan myself of Sun Kil Moon and Mark Kozelek, to the debut Sun Kil Moon album Ghosts of the Great Highway, which is a pretty great folk rock album with elements of Red House Painter's slowcore sound mixed in there. It's very drony, it's very long-winded, it's very easy on the ears, but there are some very heavy and immersive walls of guitars, electric and acoustic. This album overall is very slowly paced. Mark Kozelek's voice is much different than it is if you're listening to a lot of his contemporary stuff. His singing is a lot prettier, it's a little more nasally, it's much more toned down. He really gets kind of swallowed up in the gorgeous, drony instrumentation on this thing. The ballads are good, even if they do kind of take a little while to develop. If you're looking for a folk rock sound, a folk rock style that really emphasizes things like patience and creates a more cerebral experience without necessarily going super psychedelic or super trippy or anything like that, give this thing a listen. And that is going to be it for our folk rock starter pack. Hopefully you guys have gotten some good folk rock recommendations out of this video. All the records I've talked about in this segment are linked down below, so you can try them for yourselves, and I will see you in the next one. Make sure to leave a comment as well, letting me know what other genres you would like me to go into in a future starter pack episode. Thank you very much. Over here next to my head is another one that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, starter packs, forever.